My father married my mother's sister weeks after her funeral, but at their wedding. My brother grabbed my arm and whispered the secret that would destroy everyone in that room. The string quartet played Pachelbel's Canon like it was the first time anyone had ever gotten married in Ohio. 60 folding chairs sat in careful rows across the lawn at Shaw's Orchard Barn, draped in ivory ribbon and sprigs of sage. My father stood at the front in a charcoal suit, hands folded, jaw tight in a way I recognized from every difficult conversation of my childhood. Vivian walked down the aisle alone. No one gave her away. She didn't need it. She'd already taken what she wanted. She wore ivory, not white. Small mercy or small joke. I never figured out which. Her dress skimmed the grass. Her daughter, Lily, 7 years old, scattered rose petals 2 steps ahead of her, giggling every time the wind caught one before it landed. I wore black, not for protest. It was the only formal dress hanging in my closet, and I hadn't wanted to buy something new for this. Richard James Whitmore, the officiant said, "Do you take Vivian Renee Hale to be your lawfully wedded wife?" My father's voice cracked on the word do. Everyone around me sighed like it was tenderness. I knew better. A man's voice doesn't shake like that from joy. It shakes like that when he's been rehearsing a lie so long he's forgotten how to say the truth without flinching. I sat between my brother Daniel and our cousin Carol, my mother's first cousin, who kept dabbing her eyes with a cocktail napkin like she was watching something beautiful instead of something obscene. I made it through the vows. I made it through the ring exchange. I made it through the kiss, brief and dry, more habit than passion. I even made it through the first round of applause. Then Daniel's hand closed around my wrist. "Grace." His voice was low, urgent, nothing like his usual calm. "We need to talk, right now." I turned. His face had gone the color of the folding chairs. "Daniel, the ceremony just now." He was already pulling me up, weaving me through the standing crowd, past my father's business partner and 2 women from Vivian's book club, toward a side door of the barn marked storage. Inside, the air smelled like cut hay and folding chair dust. Daniel shut the door behind us and pressed his back against it like he thought someone might follow. He pulled a thick cream envelope from inside his suit jacket. I recognized the paper before I recognized the handwriting. My mother's stationery, the kind she'd used for thank you notes and grocery lists for 30 years. Her handwriting covered the front, shaky in places, steady in others, every word finished. "A lawyer called me this morning," Daniel said, "before we even got here. He said Mom hired him 2 years ago, told him not to contact us unless Dad remarried." My stomach dropped somewhere near my shoes. "Grace," Daniel said, and his voice finally broke. "Mom knew. She knew everything, and she's been waiting for today." Through the thin barn wall, I could hear my father's laugh, the same easy laugh from every Thanksgiving of my childhood. I could hear glasses clinking. I could hear the DJ announcing the first dance. I looked down at the envelope in Daniel's hands and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. "Read it," I said. "All of it." Before I explain what was in that letter, I need to back up. 3 years, maybe more. Because none of what happened in that storage room made sense without the whole shape of my family behind it. My name is Grace Whitmore. I'm 31. I work as a compliance analyst at First Miami Valley Bank in Dayton, Ohio, which is a fancy way of saying I spend 8 hours a day looking for numbers that don't add up, transactions that don't match invoices, accounts that move money in patterns no honest person needs. It's tedious work. It's also the reason I noticed things other people didn't. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, taught 11th grade English at Fairmont High School for 26 years. She was quiet, careful, the kind of woman who reread every email twice before sending it and never once raised her voice in an argument, because she didn't need to. She had a way of saying 4 words that could end a fight faster than anyone else's 40. She married my father, Richard Whitmore, in 1991. He worked his way up from a warehouse floor to regional sales manager at Hendricks Industrial Supply over 20 years, the kind of career that comes with a company car and a lot of dinners with clients he never talked about at home. My brother Daniel was born in 1992. I came 4 years later, in 1995. We grew up in a brick colonial on Fenwick Lane in Kettering, 10 minutes from where my mother taught and my father worked, in the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business except apparently their own. My mother's younger sister, Vivian, was always around. She was 7 years younger than my mom, the kind of aunt who showed up with movie tickets instead of advice, who let Daniel and me stay up late when she babysat, who my mother loved with the specific, complicated devotion you save for a sibling you've spent your whole life protecting. Vivian never quite landed anywhere. She waited tables through her 20s, sold real estate for 2 years that never took off, dated men my mother didn't approve of, and men my mother liked even less. By the time Lily was born, in March of 2018, Vivian was 34, unmarried, working the front desk at a chiropractic office in Centerville, and telling anyone who asked that Lily's father was a man named Marcus who'd moved to Arizona before the pregnancy test came back positive. I believed that story for 6 years. So did Daniel. So I think did my mother most of the time. Almost all of the time. Looking back, there were smaller signs even before that, ones I only recognize now that I know what I'm looking for. My father traveled for work more than most sales managers I've since met through my own job, sometimes 10 or 12 nights a month, and always to the same rotation of cities: Cincinnati, Columbus, Louisville. He kept a second garment bag packed in the hall closet, ready to go on short notice, which struck me as efficient when I was a teenager and strikes me now as something closer to preparation. My mother used to joke, lightly, that she'd married a man who loved his job more than he loved staying home. I used to laugh along with her. I understand now that some jokes are just griefs that haven't been been named yet. My mother and Vivian had lost their own father when Vivian was 11 and my mother was 18. My mother had more or less raised her through the rest of adolescence, while my grandmother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry to keep the lights on. That history mattered. It's why my mother forgave Vivian things she wouldn't have forgiven anyone else. Why she kept inviting her to every holiday even when Vivian showed up late or borrowed money she never quite paid back. $400 here, $600 there, always with a story attached. My mother used to say, only half joking, that raising Vivian had been her first practice run at motherhood. I think that's part of why the betrayal cut as deep as it did. It wasn't just a sister. It was something closer to a daughter. There was one night I didn't understand until much later. Thanksgiving, 2019. I was 24, home from my first real job, sitting at my parents' kitchen table while my mother rinsed dishes at the sink. My father had gone out to move his car, he said, because it was blocking Vivian's in the driveway. He was gone 11 minutes. I know because I checked my phone twice, bored, waiting for pie. When he came back in, my mother didn't turn around from the sink. She just said, very quietly, "New phone lock, Richard?" "What?" he said. "You changed your passcode. Sunday. I noticed because I went to check the score on your phone and it didn't work anymore." "I didn't change anything." "You did," she said, still not turning around. "It's fine. I just noticed." It wasn't fine. I could feel it wasn't fine. The way you can feel a room's temperature drop before you understand why. My father laughed it off, said something about a security update, and the conversation moved on to whether Daniel was bringing his girlfriend to Christmas. I forgot about it, filed it under normal marital static, the kind every long marriage accumulates. I didn't know then that my mother had already found a receipt in his jacket pocket 2 weeks earlier. Jasmine Terrace, a restaurant in Cincinnati, 40 minutes from Kettering, a city neither of them had any reason to visit on a Tuesday night when my father told her he was at a sales conference in Columbus. I didn't know she'd started keeping a small spiral notebook in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, tucked under a stack of paperback mysteries, where she wrote down dates, receipts, excuses that didn't quite fit together. I didn't know any of that. What I knew was the surface. My father, steady and a little distant, the kind of dad who showed up to every recital but checked his phone through half of it. My mother, patient in a way that looked like strength and was actually, I understand now, a woman quietly building a case. Vivian was at every family dinner. Vivian brought Lily to every holiday. Vivian sat next to my mother at my cousin's wedding in 2021, laughing at the same jokes, sharing the same bottle of wine, and if you'd told me then that my mother already suspected her own sister, I would have said you didn't know either one of them. There was another moment further back that only made sense to me later. In the summer of 2018, 3 months after Lily was born, our family took a joint vacation to a rental cabin in Hocking Hills. My parents, Daniel, me, and Vivian with baby Lily in a portable crib. My father spent most of that week on business calls, he said, stepping outside with his phone at odd hours, sometimes past midnight. I remember my mother mentioning, almost offhand, that Hendrick's Industrial Supply didn't usually need him that badly on a Tuesday. My father said something about a client in Charleston with a shipment problem. Nobody questioned it further. Vivian, for her part, seemed unusually tired that week, snapping at Daniel over something small, then apologizing and blaming the newborn and the sleep deprivation. I thought nothing of it at the time. New mothers get tired. Traveling salesmen get calls at odd hours. It's only in hindsight, once I had the bank statements in front of me, that I understood exactly which nights those calls had been placed and to which number. But my mother knew things. She just didn't say them out loud. Not yet. She was a woman who reread every email twice before sending it. I think, in her own way, she was doing the same thing with her marriage. Rereading it, checking the words against what she already knew to be true, waiting until she had enough to be certain before she said anything at all. She never got the chance to say it the way she wanted to. In February of 2023, she started losing weight without trying. In March, the back pain got bad enough that she finally saw a doctor. By April, she had a diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist gave her, at the outside, a year. She lasted 4 months. The 4 months between diagnosis and the funeral moved fast and slow at the same time, the way I imagine a car crash does. Fast, because there was never enough time to catch up. Slow, because every single day inside a hospital room stretches out longer than it has any right to. Vivian showed up the second week. She brought soup, the good kind, from a deli in Oakwood, not the canned stuff. She sat with my mother during chemo when Daniel and I had to work. She held her hand during the worst of it, in April, when the pain got bad enough that my mother stopped pretending it didn't. I was grateful. I want to say that clearly because it matters for what comes later. I was grateful to my aunt for showing up when my mother needed people to show up. By May, Vivian was staying over 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, in the guest room down the hall from my parents' bedroom. My father said it made things easier. Someone to help with the overnight medications, someone to sit with mom when he had to sleep because he wasn't sleeping much either. That was the first ceiling. It felt reasonable. A sister helping her dying sister. I didn't question it. My mother died on July 14th, 2023, at 4:52 in the morning, in a hospital bed set up in the living room of the house on Fenwick Lane, with Daniel holding one hand and me holding the other. My father was in the kitchen making coffee he never drank. Vivian was asleep upstairs in the guest room. At the funeral, 3 days later, I watched my father stand at the front of the church, hollowed out, gray-faced, accepting condolences like a man underwater. Vivian stood a few feet behind him the entire receiving line, close enough to catch him if he swayed. At one point, when a distant cousin hugged him too hard and he stumbled, her hand shot out and gripped his elbow before anyone else could react. Steady, practiced, like she'd done it before. I noticed it. I filed it away, the same way I'd filed away the passcode conversation 4 years earlier. Grief makes people cling to whoever's closest. I told myself that. I believed it mostly. 6 weeks after the funeral, my father called Daniel and me to the house for dinner. He'd made lasagna, my mother's recipe, badly. Vivian sat next to him at the table where my mother used to sit. I want you both to hear this from me, he said, before you hear it from anyone else. Vivian and I have gotten close since your mother passed, closer than I expected, and I've asked her to marry me. Daniel put his fork down. I remember the sound of it against the plate, sharp in the silence. Dad, I said, Mom's been gone 6 weeks. I know how it sounds, he said. I do, but your mother would want me to be happy. She'd want this family to have someone to hold it together. And Vivian's already family. This isn't some stranger, Grace. This is your aunt. That's exactly the problem, Daniel said. I need you to try to understand this, Vivian said, reaching for my father's hand on the table. Her voice was soft, wounded, the voice of a woman who'd spent years perfecting the art of sounding hurt without raising it. I loved your mother more than anyone. I would never do anything to dishonor her. I've spent 6 weeks taking care of your father because someone had to, and I'm sorry if that makes me the villain in your eyes, but I'm not going to apologize for loving this family. I said nothing. I had learned, working compliance for 6 years, that the person who talks first in an interview usually says something they regret. I let the silence sit. You're both upset, my father said, filling the silence I'd left. That's fair, but I need you to know I've made my decision. I'd like your blessing. I don't need it, but I'd like it. He didn't get it that night. He got our silence, and eventually our exit. Daniel gripping the steering wheel so hard on the drive home that his knuckles went white. That was the second ceiling, and like the first, my father broke through it without so much as a pause to see if we'd survived the fall. Over the next 2 months, I became the executor of settling my mother's more complicated finances, the accounts that had both their names on them, the retirement funds that needed to be split according to her will, the medical bills that were still trickling in from the hospital. My father asked me to handle it because I understood the numbers. He didn't understand that understanding numbers meant I understood exactly when they stopped making sense. I found the account in September. Fifth Third Bank, ending in 4417, opened in 2016, not connected to any of the accounts my mother had known about, funded by a standing transfer of $1,200 a month straight out of my father's paycheck, every month, for what looked like almost 8 years running. The statements showed hotel charges, restaurant charges, a jewelry store in Cincinnati. One name kept appearing in the memo lines of transfers into the account from a secondary source, V. Hale. I sat with that statement open on my laptop for a long time. I didn't confront him, not yet. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like I was a hero from the beginning, marching straight toward justice. I wasn't. I was a woman who had just buried her mother, staring at proof that her father had been funding a second life for the better part of a decade, and I didn't know what to do with it except write down the account number, the dates, the dollar amounts. In a document I kept password protected on a drive at my apartment. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. Maybe I was protecting myself from a truth I wasn't ready to hold. Maybe I already knew, somewhere under the part of my brain still functioning normally, that this was bigger than an affair. When I did finally ask my father about the account, in October, over coffee at the same kitchen table where he'd announced his engagement, I kept my voice level. Compliance training. Never accuse. Ask. There's an account ending in 4417, I said. Fifth Third. I found it going through Mom's estate paperwork. Can you tell me what that is? His face didn't change much. That was the thing about my father. He'd had 8 years of practice keeping his face still. That's a business account, he said. For client entertainment, Hendricks reimburses some of it comes out of pocket. It's not relevant to your mother's estate. It's got some restaurant charges in Cincinnati, a jewelry store. Grace. His voice took on the tired, wounded tone I'd hear so much more of in the months ahead. I have had to bury my wife of 32 years and figure out how to keep this family together. And now my daughter is going through my personal accounts like I'm a suspect. Is that really what you want to do right now? Is that really who you want to be? I let it go. I want to be honest about that too. I was 30 years old, grieving, exhausted, and my father had just made me feel, in 4 sentences, like the villain of a story I hadn't written. That's a particular kind of manipulation. The kind that doesn't deny anything so much as it makes the question itself feel like the crime. I kept the document anyway. I didn't delete it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years finding numbers that didn't add up, wasn't ready to let it go, even if I wasn't ready to use it. By December, the wedding planning had begun in earnest. Vivian picked a venue, Shaw's Orchard Barn, 45 minutes outside Dayton, the kind of place that books out a year in advance, except when the groom's company happens to be a preferred corporate sponsor and can pull strings. She picked ivory and sage as the colors. My mother had repainted their bathroom over that exact shade of sage in 2015 because she said it made her feel like she was drowning in pond water. I don't think Vivian remembered that, or maybe she did, and it didn't occur to her that it mattered. My father called me in January and asked if I would be a bridesmaid. I can't do that, I told him. You're being cruel, he said. To Vivian, and honestly, to me. Do you have any idea how hard this year has been? I lost my wife. I'm trying to build something new so this family doesn't fall apart, and you and your brother are punishing me for trying to survive. I'm not trying trying to punish you, I said. I just can't stand up at that wedding. Your mother would be disappointed in how you're handling this. That one landed. He knew it would. He'd been landing lines like that on me since I was 12 years old, and it still worked. Some small, stubborn part of me still flinching at the idea that my mother, wherever she was, might be disappointed in me instead of in him. I found out later from Daniel that my father had told Carol and half a dozen other relatives that Daniel and I were struggling to accept his happiness, that we'd become distant and difficult since the funeral, that he hoped we'd come around before the wedding. He never said we were wrong. He was smarter than that. He just made sure that if we ever did say something, we'd already been cast as the ones who couldn't move on. In February, I tried a different approach. I asked Vivian to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, at a diner off Far Hills Avenue we used to go to when I was in college, and needed to vent about a bad grade or a worse boyfriend. I told her I wasn't trying to ruin her happiness. I told her I just needed to understand how this had happened so fast, less than a year after we buried my mother. Vivian reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture she'd use months later at the head table, right before everything fell apart. Grace, I know this looks fast from the outside, she said, but grief doesn't follow a calendar. Your father and I found comfort in each other during the worst thing either of us has ever been through. I would never have let myself feel anything if I thought for 1 second it would hurt you or Daniel. You have to know that. I don't have to know anything, I said. I'd like to, though. Your mother's illness brought us closer than we'd ever been, Vivian said. I sat with her more nights than anyone. I think, in a strange way, some of that love just transferred. I know that sounds impossible to you right now. Someday I hope you'll understand it wasn't about replacing her. It was about not being alone and missing her. It was, I would later understand, a nearly perfect performance, built from a version of the truth just close enough to survive scrutiny. She had sat with my mother. She had grieved her, in whatever complicated, compromised way she was capable of. What she left out was the 6 years before that, the passcodes and the hotel receipts and the Tuesday nights in Cincinnati. She'd learned, the way my father had, that the most convincing lie is the one built around a true detail. I paid for the coffee. I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot, because some old habit in me still wanted to believe her, and I drove home and added the date to the document on my drive. Daniel tried his own version of intervention in March, calling our father's brother, our Uncle Ed, in Columbus, hoping a voice from outside the immediate chaos might land differently. Ed listened to Daniel's concerns, then called our father directly and reported back that Richard had assured him everything was fine, that his children were struggling with grief and taking it out on the two people trying to move forward. Ed believed him, or wanted to. He sent Daniel a text a few days later that read, essentially, that families heal in their own time, and maybe we all just needed to give this one some grace. Daniel didn't call anyone else after that. He told me later he'd started to understand that our father hadn't just gotten away with something. He'd built, over years, an entire audience conditioned to take his version of events at face value, the way people do for a man who has never given them an obvious reason not to. It made Daniel angrier than almost anything else that happened that year, angrier even than the wedding itself. Watching people choose the easier story, he said, was its own kind of betrayal, even from people who hadn't done anything wrong themselves. I didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table in January, refusing to be a bridesmaid, that my mother had been building a case against him for years before I ever opened that Fifth Third statement. I didn't know that somewhere in a lawyer's office in Dayton, a file with my name on it was sitting in a locked drawer, waiting for a date neither Daniel nor I knew was coming. I just knew that something in me had gone very quiet and very careful, the way it did at work when a number refused to add up. I kept my file. I kept my silence. I RSVP'd yes to the wedding because Daniel asked me to come, because he didn't want to face it alone, and because some part of me, the compliance analyst part, wanted to be in the room when it finally happened. I didn't know yet what it would turn out to be. I just knew it was coming. Daniel opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were 4 folded pages of my mother's handwriting, plus a second, smaller envelope marked "For the lawyer only," and a slim stack of printed documents held together with a binder clip. "Read it to me," I said. My own hands had started shaking too, but I needed to hear it in her voice, or as close to her voice as Daniel's could get. Daniel unfolded the first page. "Grace, Daniel," he read, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and your father has remarried. I need you to know I didn't want it to be this way. I wanted to be wrong." His voice cracked on wrong. He kept going. "I found out in October of 2019 that your father was having an affair. I'd suspected for almost a year before that. A new passcode on his phone. Calls he took in the garage with the door shut. A receipt from a restaurant in Cincinnati called Jasmine Terrace. Dated a Tuesday, he told me he was in Columbus. I confronted him once, in November of that year. He told me I was imagining things. He told me grief and stress were making me paranoid. I want you to know that for a while, I believed him. I wanted to believe him more than I wanted to believe myself. I thought of the kitchen table. New phone lock, Richard? I thought of the 11 minutes he'd spent moving his car in the driveway. I stopped confronting him," Daniel read, "and started watching instead. I kept a notebook. Dates, excuses, amounts of money I couldn't account for. I told myself I was building a case in case I ever needed one, though I didn't let myself think too hard about what that meant. In the spring of 2021, I found a bank statement in his briefcase for an account I didn't recognize. Fifth Third, ending in 4417. I copied the account number down and didn't say anything. I wasn't ready yet. My stomach turned over completely. The same 4 digits I'd found on on my own, 18 months after her, sitting at my kitchen table with a laptop and a cup of coffee going cold. When I got sick, Daniel read, and his voice dropped almost to a whisper. I hired an attorney, David Feldman, in April of 2023, 2 weeks after my diagnosis. I gave him everything, the notebook, copies of the statements I'd found, and I asked him to do something I should have done years earlier. I asked him to find out for certain who your aunt's daughter's father really was. I felt the room tilt slightly. I'd suspected for a long time, Daniel read. Lily has your father's eyes. She has his laugh, the specific way he tips his head back when something really gets him. I told myself I was seeing things that weren't there, the way a scared woman sometimes does. But Mr. Feldman hired an investigator. He obtained, through legal means I won't detail here, a sample sufficient for testing. The results came back in June of 2023, 5 weeks before I died. 97% probability. Your father is Lily's biological father. She was conceived in the summer of 2017, while Vivian and I were still, in every way that mattered, a family, while she sat at our table every Sunday and told me she loved me like a sister. Daniel's hand was shaking so badly now that I reached over and steadied the page for him. I'm not writing this to hurt you, he read. I'm writing it because I refuse to let a lie be the last word in this family. I rewrote my will on June 2nd, 2023, 6 weeks before I died. Everything that was mine alone, my jewelry, the 2 accounts under my maiden name that your father never knew about, the 40 acres of land in Preble County that my own mother left to me, goes to the 2 of you, in full, split evenly. Your father receives only what Ohio law requires a spouse to receive, and not 1 cent more. Vivian receives nothing. Not a photograph. Not a dish from my kitchen. Nothing. He turned the page. I've asked Mr. Feldman to hold this letter, along with copies of everything. The bank statements, the paternity results, my notebook, until the day your father remarries, if he does. I didn't want to detonate this while I was still alive to watch the fallout. I didn't have the strength left for that. But I wasn't going to let him walk into a new marriage, standing on a lie, 8 years deep, in front of everyone who loved us, without the truth in the room. If he's going to do this, he's going to do it in the light. The last lines were shorter, shakier. I could picture her, weeks from the end, propped up in that hospital bed in the living room, finishing this by hand because she didn't trust herself to dictate it and get it right. Grace, you always found the numbers that didn't add up. I used to worry that made you hard. I don't worry about that anymore. Daniel, you always wanted to believe the best about people, even your father. I loved that about you, and I'm sorry I'm asking you to stop believing it today. I love you both more than these 4 pages could ever say. Do whatever you need to do with this. I trust you. I always have. Daniel set the letter down on top of a stack of folding chairs. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Through the wall, I could hear the DJ calling everyone to the dance floor for the father-daughter dance. Vivian and Lily, 7 years old, a flower girl in white lace who had no idea what she'd just become in the space of 4 handwritten pages. I picked up the binder-clipped documents, bank statements, matching every dollar figure I'd found on my own 18 months later. A photograph printed on plain paper, dated in the corner, August 2017, my father's arm around Vivian's waist outside a hotel in Cincinnati, 4 years before I ever suspected a thing, and a single sheet from a lab in Columbus, a string of percentages and probabilities that reduced 8 years of my family's history into one clean, devastating number. I looked up at Daniel. She knew, I said. She knew years before either of us. She built the whole case, Daniel said, by herself, while she was dying. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I folded my mother's letter along the same creases she'd folded it, careful, the way you'd handle something alive. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand and straightened his jacket. What do we do? Daniel asked. His eyes were wide, uncertain, the folder of evidence trembling slightly in his hands. I thought about my mother, propped up in that hospital bed, exhausted, finishing every sentence by hand because she needed us to know the truth before she ran out of time to say it herself. She hadn't handed us a bomb by accident. She'd built it on purpose, timed the fuse, and waited 11 months for the exact right room to detonate it in. We go back out there, I said. Grace, wait. Think about this. Once we do this, there's no taking it back. Good, I said. I don't want to take it back. I took the binder-clipped documents from him and left the letter itself folded inside its envelope, tucked into my clutch. I didn't need to read Mom's private words out loud to a room of 60 people. I needed the numbers. The numbers were mine to present. We walked back out into the reception just as the DJ was announcing the toasts. My father stood near the head table, champagne glass raised, Vivian beside him in her ivory dress, Lily sitting at their feet playing with a fallen rose petal. I didn't wait for an invitation. I'd like to say something, I said, loud enough to carry over the last note of the song fading out. The room turned. My father's smile flickered, just slightly, the way it used to when I was a teenager and asked a question he didn't want to answer. Grace, he said, low, warning, not now. Actually, I said, now is exactly right. I set the documents on the head table in front of his champagne glass. I kept my voice level. Compliance training, state the facts. Let the facts do the work. In October of 2019, my mother found a receipt from a restaurant called Jasmine Terrace in Cincinnati, I said. You told her she was imagining things. You told her grief was making her paranoid. I know, because she wrote it down. She wrote all of it down. A murmur moved through the crowd. My father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Grace, this isn't the place. There's a bank account. count. I kept going. Fifth, third, ending in 4417, opened in 2016. You told me 4 months ago that it was for client entertainment. It's not. It's funded $800 to $1,200 a month for 8 years into hotels, restaurants, and a jewelry store in Cincinnati. The memo line on half the transfers says V. Hale. Vivian's face had drained of color. Beside her, an older woman I recognized as Vivian's book club friend had gone very still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. You're upset, my father said, his voice climbing, the same wounded register he'd used on me at the kitchen table in October. Your mother just passed, and I understand that's hard, but making a scene at my wedding? My mother knew, I said, and something in my own voice surprised me, how calm it stayed even as my hands shook. She's known since 2019. She hired a lawyer 2 years ago and built a file while she was dying in a hospital bed in our living room because she wanted the truth in the room the day you did this. So here it is. I picked up the photograph, held it up just long enough for the closest tables to see it. August 2017. My father's arm around Vivian's waist outside a hotel. Neither of them had any business being at together. Lily is 7, I said. My voice dropped, but the room had gone quiet enough that it carried anyway. She was conceived in the summer of 2017. My mother had a paternity test run before she died. 97% probability. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Vivian stood up so fast her chair scraped back across the wood floor. You don't know what you're talking about. That's not possible, Marcus. There is no Marcus, I said, turning to her for the first time. Was there ever a Marcus? Or did you make him up the same week you found out you were pregnant with your sister's husband's child? How dare you, she said, but her voice had lost its footing, gone thin and high. Nothing like the wounded, gentle tone she'd used on Daniel and me at that dinner table in September. I loved my sister. You loved her enough to sleep with her husband for 6 years while she was alive, I said, and you loved her enough to marry him 6 weeks after we buried her. I don't need you to explain that math to me. I've already done it. My father grabbed my arm, the same grip Daniel had used to pull me into the storage room, except this one wasn't trying to protect me. That's enough, Grace. You're embarrassing this family in front of everyone we know. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up at his face, and I said the thing I'd been carrying since October, since the kitchen table, since 11 minutes moving a car in a driveway in 2019. You didn't embarrass this family, Dad. You did that yourself, one lie at a time for 8 years. I'm just the first person brave enough to say it out loud in a room you couldn't control. He let go of my arm like it had burned him. Behind me, I heard Carol's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the murmuring crowd. Richard James Whitmore. Is any of this true? My father didn't answer. That was the answer. Tom Bradley, my father's business partner and the best man that afternoon, stood up slowly from the head table, looking between my father and the documents like he was recalculating 20 years of friendship in real time. He didn't say anything either. He didn't have to. 60 people had just watched a man fail to defend himself against his own daughter, and no amount of silence afterward was going to undo what everyone in that barn had already seen with their own eyes. The wedding didn't end so much as it evaporated. Guests filed out in 2s and 3s, murmuring apologies to no one in particular, abandoning plates of untouched cake. The DJ, to his credit, had the sense to stop the music entirely rather than try to play through it. Carol found me by the gift table, her cocktail napkin abandoned, her eyes dry now in a way they hadn't been all afternoon. I need you to know, she said, that your mother told me some of this, not all of it. Enough that I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. You didn't know for certain, I said. I suspected, Carol said. That's not the same as not knowing, and I think we both understand that by now. Vivian's book club friend, a woman named Renata, who I'd exchanged maybe 10 words with in my life, stopped me on her way to the parking lot. I've known Vivian 12 years, she said. I'm going to go home and think very hard about what kind of friend that makes me. She didn't wait for a response. I never saw her at another family gathering. Tom Bradley found me by my car as I was leaving. He didn't say much. He just looked at the document still in my hand and said, I've known your father 20 years. I didn't know any of that. Then he shook his head and walked to his own car without another word. 6 weeks later, he was the one who signed off on reassigning my father's biggest accounts at Hendricks. I don't think that was a coincidence, and I don't think my father did either. Word reached my own office eventually, the way these things do in a city the size of Dayton. My supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Phil Ostrowski, who'd trained me my first year at the bank, called me into his office in September, not to reprimand me, but to tell me, a little awkwardly, that he'd heard something about a family situation from his wife, who apparently knew Carol from church. I confirmed the broad strokes and nothing more. Phil nodded slowly and said, You did the math right, Whitmore. That's all I needed to know. It wasn't much, but coming from a man who'd spent 30 years teaching people how to read a balance sheet for the truth hidden in it, it meant more than he probably realized. My father called me 4 times that night. I let it ring out each time. The 5th call I answered, mostly because I wanted him to hear my voice not shaking. You had no right, he said, before I'd even said hello. You had no right to do that to me in front of everyone I know. I had every right, I said. You did it to yourself. I just brought the receipts. Your mother's dead, Grace. Whatever she wrote in that letter, she wasn't in her right mind. The medication, the pain, people say things. She wrote it 6 weeks before she died in complete sentences, and she hired a lawyer 2 years before that to make sure it got delivered on exactly the right day. That doesn't sound like a woman out of her mind to me. That sounds like the most clear-headed thing I've ever seen anyone anyone do? He didn't have an answer for that. I hung up before he could find one. He tried a different approach 3 days later. He showed up at my apartment in Dayton, unannounced, holding a manila folder of his own. Papers, he said, proved the Fifth Third account was legitimate business spending. Printouts from an accountant he must have called that morning. I let him talk for exactly 4 minutes on my doorstep before I told him I wasn't the one he needed to convince. The bank statements weren't going to argue with him. The paternity test wasn't going to argue with him. He could take his folder to a lawyer, and eventually he did. He hired one within the week and filed a motion to contest my mother's will, arguing undue influence, arguing she hadn't been of sound mind, arguing the rewritten will 6 weeks before her death should be thrown out in favor of the older one that split everything more generously toward him. It didn't work. My mother's attorney, David Feldman, had been thorough in a way that made me understand for the first time just how long she'd been planning this. He had documented her mental competency with a signed evaluation from her own oncologist, dated the same week she signed the new will. He had witnesses. He had a video recording of the signing itself, her voice clear and steady on the recording, stating plainly that she understood exactly what she was doing and why. The land in Preble County, 40 acres that had been in my mother's family since 1958, stayed with Daniel and me. The 2 private accounts, just over $180,000 combined, stayed with us too. My father got the house on Fenwick Lane, which he'd co-owned all along, and nothing more. None of it came free, even when we won. Daniel and I split just over $14,000 in attorney's fees over the 8 months it took David Feldman to see the will contest through to a settlement. Money we paid out of the same inheritance we were fighting to keep. Daniel joked, darkly, that our mother had probably budgeted for that too, though neither of us ever found proof of it in her papers. I believed him anyway. It was the kind of thing she would have thought of. The paternity question moved slower and cost my father more than the will contest ever did. Once it was established in court, formally, with a new sample and a judge's order rather than a private investigator's discreet arrangement, my father found himself facing 8 years of back child support for a daughter he'd spent 7 years pretending was someone else's. Ohio doesn't forgive a debt like that just because the truth arrived late. The number, once the state finished calculating it, ran well into 6 figures. Hendricks Industrial Supply didn't fire him. They didn't need to. Word moves fast in a mid-sized company in a mid-sized city, and within 2 months, the client accounts that had once been his, the ones that came with the company car and the dinners he never talked about at home, had quietly been reassigned to someone with a cleaner reputation to put in front of customers. He kept his job. He lost the version of it that had let him feel important. There were smaller logistical messes too, the kind nobody thinks about until they're in the middle of one. Shaw's Orchard Barn kept the deposit, since the contract didn't include a clause for what the venue coordinator later called, delicately, a family disclosure event. Half the wedding gifts got returned over the following month, a slow trickle of boxes shipped back to department stores by guests who apparently felt the same way I did about the marriage's legitimacy. Vivian, I heard from Carol, spent most of that August on the phone with a travel agent trying to recover deposits on a honeymoon to Sedona that never happened. None of it was justice exactly. It was just the ordinary wreckage that follows any big lie once it's finally been named out loud in front of witnesses. Vivian and my father stayed married. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a tidier story if the wedding had unraveled the marriage along with everything else, and it didn't. But I heard from Daniel, who heard from Carol, who still spoke to a few people on the periphery of Vivian's old life, that the marriage that emerged from that barn was a smaller, harder thing than the one that had walked in. My grandmother Ruth called me 2 days after the wedding. She was 91, sharp as ever, still living alone in the house in Preble County where my mother had grown up. I want you to send me copies of everything, she said. Every statement, every page of that letter you're willing to share. I buried a husband and a daughter in this life, Grace, and I am not going to spend what's left of it pretending I don't know what my other daughter did. I mailed her the documents that week. She never asked Vivian for an explanation. She told Daniel, months later, that she didn't need one. The numbers were the explanation. That November, Daniel hosted Thanksgiving at his house in Beaver Creek, the first holiday without my mother's table to gather around, and the first since the wedding. He didn't invite our father. He didn't invite Vivian. He invited Carol and Ruth, who made the drive up from Preble County despite her daughter-in-law's protests that it was too far for a woman her age. We ate too much. Nobody mentioned the wedding directly, but it sat at the table with us anyway, the way absences do. At one point, Ruth reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother would be proud of what you did in that barn. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until she said it. Daniel drove out to see our father once in January, alone. He didn't tell me beforehand. He told me after, over coffee, that he'd needed to say something to our father's face that had nothing to do with lawyers or bank statements. I asked him if he ever loved her. Daniel said, really loved her. Not the version of loving her that fit around everything else he wanted. Our father hadn't answered directly. He'd said something about how complicated marriage gets after 30 years, how people grow in different directions, the kind of vague, wounded language he'd been using since October. Daniel told him that wasn't an answer, and left without staying for the coffee our father had made him. I ran into my father once myself, by accident, that following April, in the parking lot of a hardware store in Kettering. He was loading mulch into the trunk of a car I didn't recognize, a sedan instead of the truck he'd driven my whole life. He saw me before I could decide whether to duck back into my own car. Neither of us said much. He asked how work was. I asked how the house was holding up. It was the kind of conversation strangers have, not father and daughter. And I remember driving away afterward and crying harder than I had at the cemetery, because the stranger version of him was somehow worse than the version I'd stood up to at the wedding. That version, at least, still felt like something worth fighting. This one just felt like something already gone. Lily was the only person in all of it who hadn't done anything wrong, and she was the person I thought about most in the months that followed. 7 years old, caught in the middle of a paternity case and a custody arrangement, and a family that had fractured itself over choices she never made. Daniel and I talked about her more than we talked about our father. We agreed, without much discussion, that whatever else happened, we wouldn't let her grow up not knowing she had cousins who wanted to know her. It's slow. Vivian doesn't make it easy, but Daniel sends a birthday card every March, and last year, Lily wrote back for the first time. 4 sentences in a 7-year-old's careful print, thanking him for the book he'd sent. Last spring, Vivian allowed a single supervised visit, arranged through the family friend who still spoke to both sides, at a park near Lily's school in Centerville. Daniel brought a soccer ball. I brought a set of colored pencils because Carol mentioned Lily had taken up drawing. Lily was shy at first, unsure what to call either of us, and settled eventually on Cousin Daniel and Cousin Grace, which felt like exactly the right amount of distance for where we all actually were. She drew a picture of a horse before we left and gave it to me without being asked. I still have it, taped inside a kitchen cabinet where I see it most mornings making coffee. I went to my mother's grave in August, a few weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday when I knew I'd have the cemetery mostly to myself. I sat on the grass in front of the headstone. Eleanor Hale Whitmore, 1963-2023, beloved teacher, devoted mother, and I told her everything. What Daniel had read in the storage room, what I'd said at the head table, what the room had looked like when Carol asked my father, in front of 60 witnesses, if any of it was true. I cried there in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, because at the funeral I hadn't known yet what I was actually grieving. I thought I'd been grieving her. I was. But I was also grieving the father I'd believed I had, the version of him that existed in every birthday and every graduation, and every ordinary Tuesday before I understood what those 11 minutes in the driveway had actually meant. That man had never fully existed. I grieved him anyway. You can mourn a person who was partly a performance. The love you felt for them was real, even if some of what they gave you back wasn't. I sat there a long time. Long enough that the cemetery groundskeeper came by twice and left me alone both times. When I finally stood up, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter, something closer to relief. It's been 2 years now since that wedding. I still work at First Miami Valley Bank. Still spend my days finding numbers that don't add up. Though I notice now that I'm gentler with the people on the other end of those numbers than I used to be. Everyone has a reason for the gap in the ledger. Not all of those reasons are good ones. But I understand now, in a way I didn't before, how long a person can carry a discrepancy before someone finally asks them about it out loud. Daniel and I talk most weeks. We split the land in Preble County down the middle, though neither of us has done much with it yet beyond paying the taxes and mowing it twice a summer. Ruth calls it the good half of the family, which isn't entirely fair to Daniel and me, since we didn't do anything except refuse to look away. But I understand what she means. I see Lily 4 or 5 times a year, mostly around holidays that Vivian doesn't attend, arranged quietly through Daniel and a family friend who still speaks to both sides. She's 9 now. She likes horses and a card game I don't fully understand, and she has, as my mother predicted in a letter she never got to read to us, my father's exact laugh, tipped back at the exact same angle. It used to be strange to hear it. It isn't anymore. She didn't choose any of this. She's just a kid who deserves cousins who show up. I talk to my father twice a year, if that. Christmas, usually a stiff phone call neither of us enjoys. His birthday, sometimes, if I remember, and if I'm in a place emotionally where I can manage it. We don't discuss the wedding. We don't discuss my mother's letter. There isn't a version of that conversation that goes anywhere either of us wants to go, so we don't attempt it. I don't know if that's forgiveness or just fatigue. Some days I think they're closer to the same thing than I used to believe. I think about my mother constantly, but not the way I did in the first year, when every memory came wrapped in grief so sharp it was hard to breathe through. Now I think about her the way you think about someone who taught you something important without ever explaining that's what she was doing. She spent the last 4 months of her life in pain, propped up in a rented hospital bed in her own living room, and she still found the discipline to write 4 pages by hand, in complete sentences, checking her facts, timing her fuse. She didn't do that out of anger, or not only out of anger. She did it because she refused to let a lie be the last word in her family's story, and because she trusted her children to know what to do with the truth once she handed it to us. I used to think being like my mother meant being quiet, patient, careful with my words. I understand now that those things were never the whole of her. Underneath the patience was a woman who spent years compiling a file she hoped she'd never have to use. And when she ran out of time to use it herself, she made sure it would still go off exactly when it needed to, whether she was in the room to see it or not. I don't know if I inherited that from her, or if I simply recognized it the day I found the account ending in 4417 and decided, without fully admitting it to myself, that I wasn't going to look away either. I dated someone for a while, in the second year after the wedding, a physical therapist named Owen who was kind in the unremarkable, reliable way I hadn't realized I needed until I had it. It didn't work out, not because of anything he did, but because I found myself myself more than once, quietly checking receipts and call logs I had no real reason to check, running the same audit on his life that I'd once run on my father's, looking for an account ending in some 4 digits that would explain a gap that wasn't actually there. I told him eventually some of why. He was patient about it. He was also, I think, a little relieved when I ended things, because he'd started to understand he was dating a woman who trusted spreadsheets more than she trusted people, and there's only so long a person can live across the table from that. I don't say that as a complaint about myself, exactly. It's just the truth, and my mother taught me, if nothing else, that the truth is worth saying even when it isn't flattering. I became someone who verifies. I became someone who waits for a second source before she believes the first one. That instinct served me well in the one moment of my life that mattered most, in a barn outside Dayton with 60 witnesses and a folder full of bank statements. It has cost me something in every ordinary moment since, in every relationship that didn't come with a paper trail to check. I'm working on that. I see a therapist in Oakwood every other Tuesday, a woman named Dr. Marsh who has a lot of patience for a client who wants to fact-check her own feelings. It's slow. Most worthwhile things are. I think about the title of this whole ordeal sometimes. If it had one, the way I imagine other people's worst days get compressed into a single sentence somewhere online, stripped of everything except the shock of it. My father married my mother's sister weeks after her funeral. That's true as far as it goes, but it was never really the headline. The headline was the 11 months my mother spent watching and waiting and building something quieter and more patient than rage, because she understood something I only fully learned myself once I stood at that head table, that the truth doesn't need you to be loud. It just needs you to be ready when the room finally goes quiet enough to hear it. I don't know if my father ever really understood what she did for us in the end. I don't think Vivian does either. I think they both still tell themselves some version of a story where grief made them reckless, where love found them at an inconvenient time, where none of it was really a choice so much as something that happened to them. I've stopped needing them to see it any other way. That's not forgiveness. It's just no longer my job to hold the mirror up for people who've decided not to look in it. There's a version of this story where I burn the whole family down and call it justice and walk away clean. That's not what happened, and I don't think it's what my mother wanted. Not really. My father still exists in my life, diminished, at a distance, but present. My aunt is still my aunt, even though I haven't spoken to her since the reception and don't know if I ever will again. Lily is still growing up in the wreckage of choices she didn't make, and no bank statement or paternity test undoes that for her. No matter how satisfying it felt to lay them out on that head table in front of 60 witnesses, what I got instead of a clean ending was something closer to the truth, which is messier and slower, and doesn't resolve as neatly as the moment Carol asked my father, in front of everyone we knew, if any of it was true. He never answered her. I think about that a lot. Not the documents, not the child support, not the land in Preble County. Just the silence after her question, and what it cost him to have nothing to say. My mother married my father in 1991 and spent 32 years building a life with him that turned out to be only partly real. She married my aunt into that same lie, unknowingly, generously, for years, before either of us understood what we were looking at. And weeks after we buried her, he tried to build a second life on the same foundation, in front of 60 guests who thought they were watching love rebuilt out of grief. They weren't. They were watching a woman who'd been dead for 11 months finally get the last word. I think that's the part of this story I keep coming back to. Not the reveal, not the confrontation, not even the relief I felt sitting on the grass at her grave that August afternoon. It's that my mother, sick and exhausted and running out of time, still managed to do one more thing for her children before she left us. She made sure that whatever we lost when we lost her, we wouldn't also lose the truth. Some things you can't get back once they're gone. She made sure that one wasn't one of them.